Hello guys, this is the second part of testing in education setting. Uh, we covered a few tests on intelligence measures in the previous video. In this video, I'm going to take you through a few tests on aptitude, personality, and interest. This again is pretty informative, and all of this is purely for your knowledge. Quite a few of these tests that are there in this video have been used quite a bit in the Indian population. I think some of them you would also be using as a part of your syllabus in your probably in the testing aspect. So let's move on. I'm first going to take you through a few concepts. The tests that we're looking at under aptitude, we're just looking at one test called the differential aptitude test. Under personality, we're looking at child's personality questionnaire, child's apperception test, and high school personality questionnaire. For interest, we're looking at Strong's vocational interest bank. And under entrance tests, we're looking at the scholastic assessment test and the graduate record examination aptitude test, which is the SAT and the GRE. All of these tests are really easy to understand, and there are not too many details, but I will take you through the understanding of where they can be used and a few of the basics that you need to know, like the kind of items, the norms, the psychometric properties, a few applications, and how they can be used. So first I'm going to explain to you what aptitude is about. Human aptitudes have a lot of potential, but maybe they manifest in different activities. All right. These activities can reveal what a person can perform and how well they can perform. So if a lot of people perform the same activity, the level, the nature, and even the quality of the way they perform will differ. So individuals vary in their capacities to perform a certain task, and these capacities can be called as aptitudes. So aptitude comes from the word aptos. All right, it is a Latin word which in English means fitted for. So we're actually looking at a combination of characteristics indicative of an individual's capacity with training, where they can acquire some kind of knowledge, skills, or learn certain types of responses. So we're looking at combination, which means a lot of things together, a lot of kinds of characteristics together for aptitude, where an individual's capacity is tested, wherein the individual can acquire skills with training. So when I say a lot of people have abilities. Ability is something that you already have within you, okay, and not something that requires a lot of training. But when I say aptitude requires training. So let's say we're looking at innate abilities which are present, and when they are honed and trained, they can become your aptitude. So your ability with substantial amount of training and skill set can become an aptitude. Okay, so an aptitude test, what does that look like? It measures a person's potential ability in a task of a special kind with a restricted range. So the task, when I say restricted range, is not too easy and not too difficult. the task follows a normal distribution curve. So we're looking at how a person performs with the amount of potential he has within him after a certain amount of training on a test, right? So we must look at how aptitude is required to be tested, especially before jobs. Now, what is inherent in a person would come about and would become apparent when he performs a task, which would definitely mean he has the ability for it. Like we all, some of us have a good ability for drawing, but sometimes we don't really have too much direction as to how to hone it better and give it structure, right? Because everybody's not gifted. So with a lot of training, we can then say that we have the aptitude for art. So psychologists believe that whatever a person is endowed with genetically, along with a little practice and learning and shaping, can result to aptitude. An aptitude can be considered as a special ability, let me say, which helps an individual to acquire more proficiency in that field. Now, some of the different kinds of aptitude tests that we can look at is mechanical aptitude, musical aptitude, vocational aptitude, scholastic aptitude, numerical aptitude, all of that, right? And what are the uses? We're looking at how they can be guidance services, how they can help in choice of vocations and careers, how they can predict future successes or even failures, how we can develop a few traits within us, and they can also be used along with other constructs like intelligence, interest, and personality. So we can, if you want to do a combined understanding of a person's capacities, you can do an aptitude test with a personality test, an intelligence test, and an interest test. So having said that, we have to understand that aptitudes are a result of interaction between heredity and environment. So what you're born with and how you're trained for that. And that is why aptitudes are extremely broad, right? They look at characteristics which are already within the person for learning, but aptitudes also overlap with intelligence and achievement, personality, special kind of skills and interest. We can't look at aptitude in isolation. It does overlap with the amount of intelligence and the kind of personality a person has. So let's move on to the first test that we have to look at for this video, which is the differential aptitude test, widely used. It was created in 1947 by Bennett, Seashore, and Weisman. And right now we're looking at the 5th edition, which was released in 1990. Now the DAT is actually a multi-factor test. It's a battery of tests. So within the DAT there are 8 tests. I wouldn't really call them subtests because they are tests in themselves, but they're used together under the DAT. So I remember actually doing this test at college in the, I guess, the TY level. Yeah, in my TY. Now, while we look at this, let's understand that it measures a student and an adult's aptitude as well. Now for students, we're looking at grades 7 to 12. Mostly it's used with students. There are 2 forms available. All right, we have level 1. Each form has 2 levels. All right, So level 1, we're looking at how it can be administered for grade 7 to 9 standard, and level 2 can be given to 10th and 12th standard, obviously, because there has to be some amount of difference in the difficulty level. And it has 510 items each. So the two original forms are Form A and B, which were also developed in 1947 to get a complete understanding and a well standardized structure to measure aptitudes of boys and girls, both in this age setup. While these tests were mostly used with students, they have also been used in the educational vocational counseling for adults out of the school for selection processes in employment. Okay. The typical way of looking at the test in terms of scoring is there is either a right or a wrong answer, and the test progresses with difficulty. So each item gets slightly tougher, and it's a timed test. Also, it's a paper pencil test, and there's an answer sheet on which the answers have to be colored and marked. You have like options A, B, C, D. Percentile ranks are available with the interpretation, and gender and grade norms are available. By grade, I mean it's 7th standard, 8th standard, 9th standard. So you would, if a child in a particular grade is being given the test, you would have to check the scores along with the with that grade norm. So if it's a 7th standard child, you would have to look for the 7th standard norms available, as well as whether the child is male or female. Now, the reliability of the test is really good. It ranges from 0.70s to 0.90s. It has a split half reliability, and validity looks at predictive validity and concurrent. So we're saying that it will predict how well a person would probably do in certain areas of aptitude. There is an Indian adaptation of this test by J.M. Ojha, and the two forms which are labeled are called as Form L and H. Again, it has two levels and has those number of items which keep getting difficult as it progresses. And there are 3 sub-tests within it. Now, before we move on to the next test, I would like to tell you that the DAT was revised a number of times. In 1962, in 1972, and a couple of times after that as well. Now, the aptitudes that we're looking at to measure, when I mentioned at the third point on the screen that it has 8 subtests, we're looking at verbal reasoning. Verbal reasoning typically looks, it takes 30 minutes, and it consists of analogies, right? Like, for example, dash is to bark as cat is to dash. So your answer would be dog is to bark as cat is to mew. And these combinations are given in the form of A, B, C, D. The person just has to select the correct combination and fill the blanks. So that's how it looks, and it kind of tests an ability to abstract or generalize and think in a constructive manner. And it also tests fluency and vocabulary skills. The next one is numerical ability. Again, it takes 30 minutes for this test, and we're looking at understanding of numerical relationships and how to handle arithmetic concepts. So we're just not just looking at calculation. Here we're also looking at reasoning as part of numerical ability. Abstract reasoning is the third one, which also takes 30 minutes. It's again a non-verbal measure, and there are a lot of drawings and diagrams wherein we have to understand how well the individual can reason out the geometric shapes and designs. So they have to understand the principles, what follows what should come in next, what will logically follow, like patterns, etc. Then there's something called as conceptual speed or clerical speed and accuracy. Okay, this takes 6 minutes. All right, and it is used to measure the speed of response in a very simple perceptual task. So, for example, the student must first select the combination in the booklet, and he has to remember what it is and try to figure out the same combination in a group of other similar combinations on the answer sheet. So he has to pretty much just remember what he saw and check identical combinations. Also, it involves a little bit of like copying a few things down into the answer sheet and all this. So typical clerical work, but it's speed. So it's speed and accuracy is tested in this subtest. Then you have the mechanical reasoning subtest, which again takes 30 minutes, and it really looks at um, pictorially understanding mechanical situations and how we need to understand what would fit where and how would it work out. So the ability measured by mechanical reasoning may be regarded as one aspect of intelligence, because the items are given pictorially, and they are presented in the form of mechanical situations, and with a one word question you have to give some form of a correct answer. The next one is space relations, which is again a 30 minutes test, which looks at the ability to visualize an object from a picture that has been frequently used. So they have to imagine how an object would appear if they are rotated in different ways. So it's drawn in that way, and it has to be used effectively till you come to maybe filling the fifth set, where if it is turned in this manner after turning it 4 times, how would it appear the fifth time? So a lot of spatial orientation, perception, visualization, these kind of things are tested. So a person who's very imaginative would probably have a good mental representation to be able to manipulate these questions and answer correctly. Most of these objects are given in three-dimensional format. So the cubes, cuboids, that's what is drawn. The spelling and language test is what we're looking at as the last test, where it takes 35 minutes for this one, and all words on the first two editions were selected from a previous test in 1937. However, right now the test looks at a person's ability to see errors in grammar, punctuation, capitals, what kind of formal writing is required, etc. So all kinds of things that come under language use and spelling. Now the test can be done in groups and individually as well, and it takes about 2.5 hours overall. The norms we have already looked at. There are gender norms available, grade norms are available, and percentile norms are available. Machine scoring and hand scoring both are possible for the test. The shortcoming with this test is that it cannot really pinpoint one specific career or one specific subject that the person should pursue, but it definitely gives us a list of areas that we can work in based on the aptitudes that we have for the highest scoring tests. In India, the use of DAT is quite widespread. Almost all career counseling organizations over here in Pune also make a lot of use of the DAT. All right. Now, the DAT can be used for counseling, for career counseling, even for vocational guidance, for as an employment screening, and all of that. So overall, a very good test and quite widely used. So that's about it for DAT. Let's move on to the next concept that we're looking at, personality. So what do we mean when we say personality? It's the dynamic organization of psychosocial systems in an individual. When I say psychosocial, it's mental and all your other capacities in an individual, which will determine that person's interaction with the environment. So what kind of personality does he have on the inside, to then understand how he interacts with the environment on the outside. This is a definition given by Alport. Also, Frank was one of the people in the field of psychology who introduced a projective method, which we're going to look at, to study personality. And projective methods actually look at unstructured stimuli. Now, what is unstructured stimuli? They're random kind of blots or shapes or different kind of situations given in a picture, like a drawing, and it means that the situation will be given meaning and interpretation from the subject. So the meaning would differ from individual to individual. So that's what a projective method is called. And mostly pictorial techniques are used. They're vague and ambiguous pictures which the person has to respond to. So there are some tests like TAT, CAT, CPQ, etc. TAT is for adults. CAT is the same test of TAT but for children, and CPQ is a questionnaire. So here in the corner you can see that this is one of the blots from Rorschach's ink blot test. So a lot of projective techniques actually look at latent and unconscious material like wishes, feelings, motives, which only come about when a stimulus is given without having it too structured. If you put forward a very structured question, you will automatically get a manipulated and structured answer. So these techniques are really good to understand all the latent and hidden material within a person. However, you need to be very trained in order to score, interpret, and give an understanding of what the responses was all about. So if you are going to use this test, you definitely need to be very trained. And a lot of people who use the test loosely are not trained to interpret responses. So let's move on to the first one. We are looking at the child's personality questionnaire. Now, this is a non-projective test. So, like I just said, like projective techniques and using pictorials, this does not use pictorials. This is a test which has a couple of factors. Okay, it was developed by Porter and Cattle in the year 1975, and it's for children from ages 8 to 12 years of age. They developed the form A of the CPQ test. Okay. Currently, there is the CPQ-R, which is the revised, which was in 1992, and it's for children from 8 to 15 years of age. So they included slightly more age ranges for this test. So a great demand is seen for personality measurement in children, and the CPQ is one of the tests that are used quite widely. Now, it measures 14 independent dimensions of personality, which are also called as primary source traits. And the factors are not really named because the factors are described. So these letters have been given: factor A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, N, O, Q3, and Q4. And there are second order factors which also can be measured with the source factors, which is extroversion versus introversion, anxiety, tough poise, and independence. So there are 4 parallel forms of the test. There is A, B, C, D, each which has 140 items. So when you actually look at the total number of items, you would have to multiply 140 items into all the 4 forms, which, if I'm not wrong, is 560, which is the total number of items on the test. Now, difficult items, one good thing about the test is that they can be explained to the child, and if questions are asked, they can be definitely clarified. It takes 50 minutes to administer the test, and the test can be done in individual setting or in groups as well, because it's a questionnaire. So there would be common rules and common instructions. There are combined and separate norms both for girls and boys. So if you're looking at a huge population, you would look at combined norms, and if you're looking at individual testing, you can also go for girls and boys. Also, if you're trying to distinguish personality between girls and boys, you can use separate norms in a group setting as well. Now, the test retest reliability has been obtained for forms A and B, which have up to 0.80 reliability, and form C and D, when used in conjunction together, have 0.62 to 0.84 reliability. So both forms are quite reliable, and 2 forms are generally expected to be used. The validity which was obtained was criterion and construct, and it's quite a vast range actually, from 0.20s to 0.90s. So again, the validity coefficients were taken with different combinations of the forms. So sometimes for AB or AC and CD and maybe BD. So those validity coefficients are also available. Now, in terms of looking at the Indian context, there is a Hindi version available of the CPQ, which was created by Kapoor and Rao. It's called the BVCJ, which was made in 1972. And it has been used in a couple of settings. Mm, uh, if I'm not wrong, I read some of it in some of the tests and studies that I was reading up on. Um, I believe it's 1982. I'm not very sure. I think I've got the date wrong over there. But anyway, there is an Indian version available and it's in Hindi. And there have been tests where the test has been used in Hindi. Now, I would like to take you through a few of the factors that you need to understand. So the first factor is about how reserved a person is versus how warm-hearted and participative a person is. Factor B is about dull on the lower side and being bright on the higher side. And when I say dull, I'm talking about intelligence. So factor B is one factor where doubts cannot be cleared because it measures intelligence. Factor C is looking at emotions, where on the lower side, a person is affected by feelings a lot, and on the higher side, they're emotionally stable. Factor D looks at phlegmatic, which is a temperament where a person is really lazy, slow, inactive, versus excitable, where a person is more on the active side. Factor E looks at obedience and submissiveness versus being dominant. Factor F looks at sober on the lower side while being very enthusiastic and on the go on the higher side. Factor G looks at expedient. That means a person who does not regard rules and breaks rules very often, versus on the higher side a person who's conscientious, that is a rule abiding person. Factor H, we are looking at shy on the lower side and socially bold on the higher side. Factor I, we're looking at a tough-minded person on the lower side, whereas a tender-minded on the higher side. Factor J, we're looking at a zestful person who's vigorous on the higher side, and a person who's reflective, more introverted, and individual on the higher side. On factor N, we're looking at forthright person on the lower side, so someone who's, artless, basically, and not very street smart, and someone who is shrewd on the higher side, like more like artful, calculative, street smart. Factor O, we're looking at the lower side as confident, self-assured, and on the higher side as guilt-prone and apprehensive. Please don't misunderstand low side and high score description. It's absolutely okay for someone to have a low score on a factor, because being self-assured is better than being guilt-prone and worrisome. Okay. Q3 is on the lower side is undisciplined and a lot of conflicts with the self, whereas on the higher side it's a controlled person. Q4 on the lower side is a relaxed person, which now, like I said, it's good, versus the person who's very tense on the higher side. So there are 10 items per factor. So that makes 140 items because there are 14 factors, and 140 into 4 forms makes it 560 items in all. That's that. Mostly the two parts of the test, like I said, the two forms should be given separately to avoid a lot of fatigue and boredom, because anyway we're looking at children. After using one form, one can use the other form. A few precautions that one must take is giving proper instructions, and the child should not be forced to write the test. Apart from that, we can look at a few uses. It can be used in the educational setting to understand school achievement and the kind of personality that the child has shown. Also, we can use it in the clinical setup, in diagnosing patients, child patients who either suffer from anxiety or mild neuroticism. There are factors that measure these things, so we can look at that from the clinical aspect. Also, the test can be used to understand personality in terms of cultural differences. So there were studies which were done on the CPQ, where in Australia, England, Germany, France, etc., child's personalities were studied, and they found out that Australian profile is above an American profile in terms of shrewdness. So they're smarter than American kids. So different factors were tested with different, and they got different findings. Also, the French group was found to be less sensitive, and while the Swiss and the New Zealand children didn't vary much in their personalities, but their personalities varied a lot from the US groups. So it can also be used to understand cultural patterns. Overall, a good test, but requires a lot of patience from the child as well as the adult who's administering the test. Let's look at the next test, which is the children's apperception test. This was created by Leopold Belloc and Sonia Belloc in 1949. Now we are looking at a projective test here. All right, and this test actually has 10 pictures of humans and animals, and can be used with kids for 3 to 10 years. Now the cat H has humans in it, so it's used for children 7 to 10 years, and the cat A has a lot of animals in it, so it's used for children between 3 to 10 years. Obviously, because children slightly respond better to animals than humans, so younger kids can use the cat A, while older ones can feel free to use the cat H. So the pictures look at responses for determining a few problems like feeding problems, sibling rivalry, attitude towards parent figures, the child's relationship to the parents as a couple, the child's fantasies about aggression, and the fear of being lonely at night. So these are a few factors that they are looking at. Let's firstly look at where this test came from. So the thematic apperception test was the first test which was published by Henry Murray based on his theory of needs, and it is used mostly with adult population, and it is unsuited for young children. Because there was a need to develop a test for younger children, the CAT was devised, and it's a projective, or you can also say apperceptive method. Now here, a lot of meaning can be derived from a child's perspective by looking at these unstructured stimuli. Now, the cat is not a substitute for the TAT test. It's just completely used for children. Also, children can easily project their feelings and thoughts to animals. Therefore, the cat A was made. But in order to kind of avoid too much of childishness in the test, the test also looked at featuring 10 pictures of humans in the same social context where there are animals. So in place of the animals, there are humans. That's about it. So this was the second version, Cat H, which was developed in 1965 by the same authors, and mostly used by older children in the group, which is 7 to 10 years. Now, this version actually can be also used with slightly lower developed, or you can say mentally challenged kids. There is a Cat S form, and it has less common themes, and it looks more at parental separation and physical disability and mother's pregnancy and all of that. So there are pics of children in different family situations. So Cat S is also available as a form. Now let's look at the administration. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes, and individual testing is completely recommended because, as obviously it is a projective technique. So yeah, and the administrator has to be skilled enough to conduct the test and should not uh, be given if the child is not comfortable for the test. Also, the child has to be recommended by a professional for clinical intervention. So the test can't just be used unless it has been recommended. We must ensure that the room is quiet, there's enough lighting, and no noise in the environment so that the responses that the child gives is not disturbed. There's a wide variety of acceptable responses, which affects slightly the reliability of the test. Projective techniques have very poor reliability and validity, either which ways. Uma Chaudhary has looked into an Indian adaptation. Um, so, on Indian school children in different parts of the city of Calcutta and a few rural areas as well, even on the Abor tribes, which are on the northeast frontiers of India. So, children in the slightly better off, higher social economic status of the country did not find any difficulty in identifying with the animal pictures and the details of the original CAT, which is the Sonia Bellic version. Um, However, the village and the tribal children had difficulty in understanding that form. Now let's look at a few cards. Maybe I can just tell you a few things about the cards and the way it looks. So there are 10 cards, and the one card is like there are chicks sitting around a table on which there's a large bowl of food, and to one side is a large chicken which is dimly outlined. So what kind of response would a child give? Another card is something like there is a hen with a pipe and cane sitting in a chair in a little corner of the room, and there's a little mouse that appears in the hole. So what kind of stories? The children have to weave stories and kind of come up with what they think about it. There's another story where there's a tiger with his fangs out of his mouth and claws leaping at a monkey, which is also leaping through the air. So what does this say? A baby dog lying across the knees of an adult dog, where both figures have very less expressive features, but the figures are set in the background of a bathroom. So, the mummy dog is giving bath to the baby dog. So, what would a child come up with? So, these are the kind of cards that have this is what it looks like, and children have to weave stories around it and speak about it. Like I mentioned, the reliability and validity are not very easy to obtain, but the face validity is strong because what the child sees is what the child will emote and respond to. Findings suggest that the child's personality, handling of the child's problems in development and growth, the child's anxieties, fears, and psychological defenses can be looked at and from the counseling perspective. So the application is really good in the clinical and counseling aspect, and also which can help the child manage a lot of these issues and grow up to be a healthier person. This can be used in clinical evaluations to support diagnosis as well, and in treatment as well. Also, only in terms of support, not completely. We cannot just rely on the test. It also can be used in longitudinal research to understand how the child would respond previously and how it would respond a little later, because I'm sure the responses would change. Also in terms of counseling, and it can just be used as an icebreaker or in play therapy, where the responses are not really looked at to make sense of. So it's just used sort of like, I would not say like a game, but like an icebreaker. So that's that for the CAT test. It's a really good test, but the person who is administering and going to be making interpretation of the scores has to be extremely trained, and people do undergo training for projective technique usage as well. So gives a lot of insight into a lot of things, and it's quite a good test, I must say. Let's look at the last personality test that we're looking at under personality, which is called as a high school personality questionnaire, or commonly called as the HSPQ. Now, this was created by Cattell and Beloff in the year 1953, and it's a non projective test, which means that it does not have pictures or any kind of vague stimuli. It's a self report inventory for adolescents, which measures again 14 primary traits, the same traits that we saw in the CPQ, sort of the same traits. And there are 10 items per factor, so again 140 items, and there are 2 buffer items which are not scored. So in total, there are 142 items. And the revised version is the 1984 version, but originally it came out in 1953. The 1984 version is called as the HSPQR, which is the revised version. Now, like I said, it's the same thing like the CPQ. It has 4 forms and it takes about 1 hour to finish a form. It can be given in groups and also can be administered individually, and there's no time limit for this test. The normative sample was 9,000 students, adolescents were looked at, both girls and boys in the years 12 to 18 years of age. So this test can be used with children after the CPQ is cannot be used, because the CPQ can ideally be used only till 12. The test has good reliability from 0.50s to ranging from 0.50s to 0.90s, and construct validity is high, up to 0.70s. Also, predictive validity is available, which then helps us to predict the personality of the child. So that way it's quite a good test. The applications, if we're looking at, can be used in school settings, in educational settings, in clinical application, and in delinquency research. When I say delinquency, I am definitely looking at children who get into crimes, aggressive behavior, or any forms of psychosis. An Indian version, again in Hindi, is available, which is made by Kapoor and Mehrotra, only for the Form A, which came out in 1973. So there's no Indian version of the revised 1984 version. But however, there is one available in Hindi. So let's look at a few of the points under the HSPQ for understanding the 14 factors. So there is factor A, which is again warmth. The person is cool on the lower side and warm on the higher side. B is again intelligence. C is emotional stability. D is phlegmatic on one side, that is really, like dull and lazy, while excitable on the other. Factor E looks at dominance. Factor F looks at cheerfulness. G looks at conformity, whether a person follows rules or doesn't. Factor H looks at boldness, either shy or bold. Factor I looks at sensitivity, either tough-minded or tender-minded. Factor J looks at withdrawal. O looks at apprehension, so whether he's self-assured or whether he's self-blaming. Q2 looks at self-sufficiency, and Q3 looks at also self-sufficiency. Q4 looks at tension. Q2 under self-sufficiency is either a person who follows the crowd or a person who prefers his own decisions. That's one type of self-sufficiency. Q3 is also another type of self-sufficiency, where we're looking at undisciplined behavior versus self-control and disciplined behavior. Now, second order factors are also available, just like the CPQ, where you're looking at introversion versus extroversion, then tough boys, independence, and anxiety. So that's that for this test in terms of understanding the factors. Now, in terms of where all this can really be useful, like I've already mentioned, the HSPQ can be used to understand a variety of things like the social behavior, the clinical behavior, and how the child is doing in school and otherwise in activity. Also, it can be useful to understand achievement, the interest in schooling, and also children who drop out of school. In clinical application, it's useful to understand anxiety, any kind of chemical dependencies in adolescents, and like I said, in delinquent behavior. So, a lot of personality patterns for diagnosis of future disorders can be looked at. Some other uses is that it's useful to look at and assess emotional conflicts, behavior disorders in kind of the educational setup, and it can also be used to measure non-cognitive elements like creativity and the kind of approach in different kind of situations. Again, quite widely used test. I'm really not sure how much this is used in India and how freely it's available, but there is a Hindi version available, max to max, if we want to look at that. So that's that for the HSPQ, and these are the personality tests. We will be next looking at interest as our concept. So essentially, interest is the motivating force that impels us to attend to a person, a thing, or an activity or task, or it may be the effective experience that has been stimulated by the activity itself. So, interest is looked at as a force, something that drives you from within and pushes you to be attentive towards something or the experience that is stimulated by something by itself. So, you can see a number of interests here that people could engage in. I would also look at interest as a basic emotion which comes from an interaction between three things: the person, the user, that's you, the object or the interest that you're interested in, and the context and the situation. So music is an interest, and cooking is an interest, and traveling is an interest. So we're looking at an interaction with the person, with the context, that is maybe liking to bake, and the object, which is obviously everything that's related to cooking and baking. So why are we looking at interest? Because interest can be measured, and it's an interest inventory is like a self-report questionnaire. It's not projective, it's self-report, which is used to assess a person's likes and dislikes, which are preferences, and how they're related to his or her career goals or his external world. So you can see a couple of things there. It's slightly a small little picture, but you do see a couple of things in it. So let's look at the test that comes under interest. It's called the Strong Vocational Interest Bank, and it's called Strong because it was given by Strong. So it was developed in the year 1927 by Edward Kellogg Strong Jr. and some of his colleagues. They began to examine the activities that people from different positions and professions liked and disliked. And they came to realize that these people from these professional groups had different choices of interest. To some extent, one might expect this because people tend to choose lines of work that interest them. So I was extremely interested in psychology, so I was able to find a way out to do this professionally, and I'm really enjoying it. So that's how Strong wanted to understand how interest can be measured and the success rate of interests, measuring interest, because he found that a lot of people would stick around with their interest even 20 to 25 years later. Strong and his colleagues, found that people in the same kind of work had similar hobbies, right? Like the same type of entertainment, or reading the same kind of books, or liking the same kind of music. So I would assume that maybe in a group of psychology students, a lot of you would probably like reading books. A lot of you would probably like traveling, exploring different thoughts and perspectives. Maybe a lot of you like art, a lot of you listen to a certain kind of music, and this is how you'll connect. And with this research as a base, he set out to develop a test that would match the interests of the person to the interests and values of the group of people he or she works with, which is the criterion group. And they were happy in the careers that they had chosen. So this process is actually called as criterion keying or criterion group approach. And the test they created with this method was called the Strong Vocational Interest Bank, the SVIB. Now, let's look at the normative sample. There were about 300 people used in the beginning, and the test retest was 0.60s, and predictive validity was available. In the studies that were done on this test, a lot of individuals from many professions and occupations were taken up and were asked to respond to 400 items. All right, dealing with basically preferences like likes and dislikes to occupations and leisurely activities. Now, in the revised 1966 version, there were 399 items that were related to 54 occupations for men, and a separate form was presented with 32 different occupations for women. There are a lot of split half and odd even kind of reliability studies done, and it's given that the test retest long-term reliability coefficients were around 0.60s, and the validity indicated that the SVIB predicted good job satisfaction. So predictive validity was established. Now if we have to look at the revision, this test was actually later on revised, rather looked into by some more people, and it came to be called as the Strong-Campbell interest inventory. This version was created in 1974. Let's quickly take a look at this as well. So, one of the most interesting findings that came about for the first version was that patterns of interest remained relatively stable over time. All right, the study showed that interests remained stable for as long as 22 years, and most people modified their interests a little bit, but the interest more or less stayed the same. And a lot of studies also show that interests become well established by the age of 17. For example, Stanford kind of looked at students who eventually became physicians, and these are the students who scored high on the physician scale of the SVIB. So when they were recontacted throughout life, they tended to remain high on that scale. And despite a lot of widespread acceptance and use of the SVIB, there was a little critical bias towards the gender, because in the scales different tests were used for men and women. That's why in 1974 D.P. Campbell published this version, and it came to be called as the Strong-Campbell interest inventory. It looked at mostly the shortcomings of SVIB. So the items from both the men's and women's forms of the SVIB were merged into a single form, and that included scales which kind of removed the gender bias. Now, what we have to understand is right now we need to look at the current version, that is the 2004 version, which includes the normative sample for students, college students, as well as adults. So this test can be used across all these populations. So let me tell you that The current version actually looks at uh, it looks at um, 4 categories of uh, tests, you could say, and 4 sections rather. The first section is actually general occupational themes, and there are 6 under general occupational themes. Here it would look at describing your interests, work activities, potential skills, and personal values in 6 broad areas, which are realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. So these are the 6 occupational themes that we're looking at. In the second section, we're looking at the basic interest scales, and there are 30 of them. They identify specific interest areas under the 6 general occupational themes. So these 30 are more or less divided under the 6 occupational themes. All right, but they are broken down into more and more topics, indicating areas that are likely to be most motivating and rewarding for the person. Then we're looking at the third section, which is occupational scales, and there are 244 occupational scales, which compares a person's likes and dislikes with those of people who are satisfied working in different occupations, which again indicates your compatibility of interests with them. Section 4 is looking at personal style scales, and here we're looking at 5 personal scales, which describes preferences related to work style, learning, leadership, risk taking, teamwork, insight into the work that you do, and the best kind of environment that you kind of fit into. Now this version was run on a sample of 1125 women and 1125 men, and with a huge sampling method, the test-retest reliability was obtained. Now it was 0.84 for the first section, that is the general occupational themes. 0.74 to 0.90s was the range of reliability for the basic interest scales. 0.71 to 0.93 again was for the occupational scales, and 0.70 to 0.91 was for the personal scales. So if you see, the range is typically 70s to 90s, which is good enough reliability of all the sections under the SVIB. Concurrent validity was available for all 4 types of scales, and the scores are given as a profile summary and a response summary. So I'm just going to kind of tell you what that is about. So the profile summary provides a graphic snapshot of the profile results for immediate and easy reference. So it probably looks like a line or a bar graph, right? But the response summary summarizes your responses within each category of the strong items, and it provides data useful for your career professional. So that's what it looks like. Now the SVIB can be used extensively in the educational guidance and career assessment setup. In fact, a lot of career counseling, I'm not sure about India, definitely I'm not sure about India, but this test is used widely in other countries. And the report gives quite an extensive understanding of all your scores that you've obtained on all the sections, and then it also gives you a list of career options that would be suitable as per your choices and likes and dislikes given. So it kind of looks like this. It gives you an introduction to your report, then it gives you your general occupational themes, it gives you a closer look at it with some action steps, then it gives you an understanding of your basic interests, your understanding into occupations in your personal style, and then an interpretive report summary is given with a combination of all. And lastly, it gives you a few steps on what can you do next after attempting the test. So it's a pretty good test. And that's about it for the interest inventory. Let's move on to the last category of tests under this lecture, which is school and college entrance tests. They're widely used. They're very, very well known, and you'll figure out what they are once we start to talk about them. They help to give direction to choice of all the future career possibilities and options. For example, GRE. They also measure collective skills and knowledge over vast areas, all the knowledge that you've gained over a period of time, all your analytical thinking, knowledge related to logical thinking, pattern analysis, reasoning, all of that. And the scores are valid for different courses for a certain period of time. SAT is another one. So let's quickly run through both of them. The first one is Scholastic Assessment Test. It's also called as Scholastic Aptitude Test now. Now, the SAT 1, which is called the reasoning scale, is most widely used in college entrance tests in the US. And it is designed by a team led by Carl Campbell Brigham. So, let me take you through this aspect particularly. So he led a committee at the university, and under Princeton University, Psychological University, and under him, the team under him came up with this test. Now, it has been in use for a really long time as an admission test, which is since 1926, and it has been administered by the College Board. The College Board is not what you think a College Board is. It's actually the name of a non-profit organization in the US, and they're the ones who administer this test. So the SAT 1, which actually rather not one, like we could say I, is actually there are two sections for the reasoning scales, which is verbal and math sections. Now the verbal sections actually look at a couple of things like reasoning in terms of vocabulary. Antonyms is something that they took out, and several new questions to measure vocabulary in certain contexts were included. The math section offers questions that require students to produce their own responses, and initially the test allowed the use of a calculator, but now it doesn't. Now it emphasizes on no use of calcs. So the College Board, this NGO provides a well-written guide for taking the SAT 1, and this guide includes tips on how to write the paper, how to prepare, simple test taking strategies. Sample questions are provided with explanations, and a practice test is also given. So this is the revised version, all right, where both verbal and maths are included together. Now SAT 2 is also has also been given by the College Board, and when it was released, they looked at including subject tests. So the SAT 2 includes a direct writing test, and new tests in Asian languages, and a new English as a second language proficiency test. So these are a few changes that they have made in terms of the second SAT. Now, predictive validity is quite good of this test, because the scores definitely do predict how well the child is going to do, the student is going to do, at least in the first year of their next academic year. The predictive validity is not very strong for all the years of study in further, but at least for the first year grades, it definitely influences the first year grades. It has been proven as an important predictor of college success, which is the first year GPA that children usually get. The SAT has the highest possible psychometric adequacy of an entrance test. Now, why are we saying that? Is because the predictive validity of the SAT is really good, and the results with the SAT are entirely consistent with the other modern standardized testing ways. So when used with the cumulative GPAs, the SAT has been proven to be a very good predictor of success in college. Therefore, it shows the highest possible psychometric strength that has been achieved till now with entrance tests. It has been widely used in the 21st century, and currently we're looking at the 2016 version of the SAT, which takes about 3 hours and 50 minutes for the essay. Now, I'm going to explain this a little bit to you. Um, so, when we're looking at this inventory, we're looking at math, which takes 80 minutes, where there are numbers and operations, algebra and the functions, geometry, statistics, probability, data analysis, all of this comes under math. So this takes 80 minutes, all right. And the second part is the reading and writing aspect. So it's called evidence-based reading and writing, which takes 100 minutes. So that's a total of 180 minutes, which means 3 hours. This is compulsory. All right, and under the evidence-based reading writing, there is vocabulary, critical reading, sentence level reading, grammar, usage, diction, etc. And this additional essay is an optional thing that people give, which is given 50 minutes for completion. So the test actually looks at basic scholastic achievements in terms of maths, reading and writing abilities. Yeah, and these are tested because to the level that would be needed in order to make it through the US universities. So a lot of people give the SAT. Let's look at the next one, which is the last one, which also a lot of people generally prepare for when they're looking at studying in other countries, and it's called the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination Aptitude Test. So now this test is also a standardized test which is used as a basic admission requirement in most grad schools in America. Okay, so we're looking at graduates, that's after 12th. And this GRE is better known as one of the most commonly used tests for graduate school entrance, and it is offered throughout the year. Now, the GRE reports actually measure general scholastic abilities. Okay, so we are also looking at a computerized way of computing the scores. So it's computerized testing. You give the tests online and it is processed, and the scores are also generated online. Now, what are we looking at the GRE? Right, we are looking at how it has how it's called a GRE general test, which has 6 sections, just like we saw previously, and it measures one section of analytical thinking. So out of the 6, one section looks at analytical thinking, which is about issues and argumentative tasks. Okay, 2 sections are dedicated for verbal reasoning and 2 sections for quantitative reasoning. So that makes it 5 in all. 5 sections are done, and 1 section related to experiment or research. So this is what the general test looks like. There is also a GRE subject test, which is looking at 6 subjects, which is biology, chemistry, English, literature, math, physics and psychology, each of 170 minutes. Okay, that's how long it takes. Now, the predictive validity is really good in again in terms of predicting almost the first year graduate success school, but it has been found that the predictive validity is not very strong for success of graduate schooling throughout the 3 or 4 years that they're there. So these scores more or less indicate a good amount of success only for the first year of graduate school. So also the normative sample that was used for the GRE was really small, and the psychometric adequacy of the GRE is also not as spectacular as the SAT. So both for the reliability and validity. Nevertheless, it is quite a sound instrument, and a lot of students to date prepare for the GRE in order to get into good universities abroad. Thank you. This is all for what we are going to look at in this video. I must say that both these videos on testing have not really been too much about understanding a lot of concepts and really absorbing it. and trying to really use it in terms of the way you think with your cases, or how to guide them, or how to teach them certain strategies. These are all tests which are used in a lot of hospitals, a lot of clinics all over India and abroad. So do keep this information handy, because we are looking at understanding how severe cases can be assessed, because the checklists that we have are not going to be enough to assess if you are come across a very severe case that needs testing. So this gives you an over the top idea of a few things that have covered the educational setting. Just to run you through, we've covered tests that look at intelligence, both group tests and individual tests. And in this video, we looked at tests that look at measuring aptitude, interest, personality, and the last part was just entrance exams. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope the video has helped you. That's about it for today.